"You're obsolete," the young contractor told him, pointing a camera right at Arthur's shaking hands. He laughed at the old man's worn-out tools. He mocked his silence. He told the world that speed was the only thing that mattered. But nature has a cruel way of testing arrogance. 4 hours later, when the sky turned black and the gale-force winds stripped the million-dollar technology right off the roof, the young man was left clinging to a slick sheet of plywood, dangling 20 feet above the concrete. He screamed for help, but his expensive machines were silent. The only thing moving against the wind was Arthur. The man he had called useless was now crawling on his hands and knees into the teeth of the storm, holding a hammer that looked heavy enough to drag him down. Why would a man risk his life for the person who tried to destroy his livelihood? What Arthur did next wasn't just a rescue. It was a lesson that would break a man's ego into pieces. And it started with a single, rusty nail. The heat in Blackwood County didn't just sit on you. It pressed down like a heavy, wet wool blanket. It was the kind of humidity that made the air thick enough to chew, carrying the scent of impending rain and the sharp, resinous tang of shaved cedar. High up on the scaffolding that hugged the side of the old Veterans Community Hall, Arthur kneeled. His knees popped, a dry, cracking sound that seemed to echo the age of the building itself. He didn't mind the pain. At 65, pain was just a reminder that he was still using the machinery of his body. Arthur ran a calloused thumb over the grain of the exposed roof beam. The wood was gray and weathered, scarred by decades of storms. But underneath, the heartwood was still solid. He picked up his hand plane, a tool his father had given him before the war. The blade was honed to a mirror finish. With a slow, deliberate exhale, Arthur pushed the plane across the rough timber. A curl of wood, thin as a ribbon and smelling of history, spiraled up and drifted to the ground below. He worked with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the ticking of a clock and everything to do with the pulse of the wood. To Arthur, this wasn't a renovation. It was surgery. You didn't rush surgery. Below him, the gravel parking lot crunched. It wasn't the slow roll of a local pickup. It was the aggressive, gravel-spitting arrival of something heavy and fast. Arthur didn't look down immediately. He finished his stroke, checked the smoothness of the wood, and then, only then, shifted his gaze. A massive jet-black truck, lifted high on suspension that had likely never seen a dirt road, idled in the center of the lot. The engine hummed with a deep, menacing thrum that vibrated against Arthur's scaffolding. The door swung open, and a pair of pristine, neon-yellow work boots hit the dust. Jack Sterling stepped out. He looked less like a contractor and more like a billboard for what a contractor should look like. His safety vest was unblemished, his tool belt was stiff leather that hadn't yet formed to his hips, and in his right hand he held the true tool of his trade, a smartphone mounted on a stabilizing gimbal. "All right, guys, we are live," Jack shouted, his voice projecting not to the workers, but to the invisible audience in his hand. He flashed a practiced, white-toothed smile at the screen. "We're out here at the Blackwood project today. We've got 24 hours to flip this roof before the inspector comes, and let me tell you, it is a disaster zone." Arthur watched from above, his expression unreadable. He saw Maya, the building manager's 10-year-old daughter, sitting on the porch steps. She was clutching a worn coloring book, her eyes wide as she watched the stranger. The building was her home as much as it was a community center. Her mother lived in the caretaker's unit out back. If this roof didn't pass inspection tomorrow, the county would condemn the structure. They'd have nowhere to go. Jack swept his camera around, catching the peeling paint and the scaffolding. Then he zoomed in on Arthur. "And look at this," Jax narrated. his tone dripping with a mock sympathy that felt colder than an insult. "We've got the local talent up there." "Using? Is that a hand plane?" "Folks, drop a comment if you think we can finish a 2,000 square foot roof with a hand plane in this century." Arthur wiped his brow with a rag he kept in his back pocket. He didn't shout back. He didn't wave. He simply set the plane down and picked up his chisel. Jax bounded up the ladder, the expensive suspension of the aluminum rattling against the siding. He vaulted onto the platform next to Arthur, bringing with him the smell of expensive cologne and ozone. Up close, Arthur could see the frantic energy in the younger man's eyes. Jax wasn't looking at the roof. He was looking at the engagement numbers on his screen. "Hey, Pops," Jax said, lowering the phone slightly, but keeping the camera lens pointed at Arthur's hands. "No disrespect, but you're moving in slow motion. We're on a timeline here. I've got a crew coming in 10 minutes with pneumatic guns and prefab sheets. We're going to blast this out." Arthur looked at the young man's boots. Not a scuff on them. "Cedar breathes," Arthur said, his voice gravelly and low. "You blast it with high-pressure nails, you crack the grain, moisture gets in, rot sets in 6 months. Jax laughed, a sharp bark of a sound. He turned back to his phone. "Did you hear that? Cedar breathes." "Okay, listen. I respect the old school, I really do. But this is the real world. Speed is money. Efficiency is king." He stepped closer to Arthur, intruding on his personal space, turning the moment into a spectacle. "Tell you what. Since you want to massage the wood, and I want to fix the roof, let's make it interesting for the viewers." Jax gestured to the expansive, damaged roof. The shower peak divided it perfectly into a north face and a south face. "I take the north side. My crew, my tech, my speed. You take the south side with your antiques. If I finish first and it passes inspection, you admit on camera that your way is dead, and you walk off the job site. I take over the contract." Arthur looked past Jax, toward the horizon. The sky was bruising purple in the west. The air pressure was dropping. He could feel it in his knuckles. A storm wasn't just coming. It was already breathing down their necks. He looked down at Maya on the steps. She was hugging her knees, looking terrified by the shouting man on the roof. If Jax used cheap shortcuts, the roof would fly off the moment the wind hit 40 miles an hour. The girl would be homeless, or worse, hurt. Arthur turned his gaze back to Jax. The camera lens stared at him like a cyclops' eye. He didn't care about the internet. He didn't care about the insults. He cared about the foundation he had poured with his own hands 40 years ago. "I don't gamble with roofs, son," Arthur said quietly. "But you take the north side, just be careful with the flashing." "Is that a yes?" Jax pressed, grinning as the comment section on his screen exploded with fire emojis. "Man versus machine, old school versus the future. Let's go." Jax turned away, shouting orders into his phone as his crew's trucks began to pull into the lot below, engines revving like an invading army. Arthur stood alone on his side of the roof. He picked up his hammer. It was an old wooden-handled framing hammer, the grip worn smooth by decades of sweat. His hand trembled slightly, just a tremor, a ghost of age. But as his fingers closed around the handle, the shaking stopped. He wasn't racing Jax. He was racing the sky. The silence of the morning did not leave slowly. It was murdered. Within 20 minutes, the Veterans Hall transformed from a place of memory into a construction zone that felt more like a factory floor. 2 large air compressors roared to life in the parking lot, their engines vibrating the ground with a relentless, mechanical drone. Rubber hoses snaked up the ladders like black veins, feeding the pneumatic nail guns that now dangled from the belts of Jax's crew. On the north face of the roof, the work began with violence. Jax's team didn't place the plywood. They threw it. Sheets of cheap pressed particle board were slapped down over the rafters. Then came the sound that would define the next 4 hours. The rapid-fire cough of air guns driving 3-inch steel nails into the wood every half-second. It was the sound of speed. It was the sound of a deadline being beaten into submission. Jax stood at the peak, his phone mounted on a tripod now. He wasn't hammering. He was directing. "Keep that line straight, Tony. We need the drone shot to look clean," he shouted over the noise. He grabbed a tube of heavy-duty construction adhesive, ripped the cap off with his teeth, and squeezed a thick, chemical-smelling blue line across a joist. "Liquid stone, baby," he said to the camera lens. "Why spend an hour cutting joints when chemistry does it in 10 seconds? Work smarter, not harder." 50 feet away, on the south face, the atmosphere was different. It was almost a vacuum. Arthur knelt on a pad that had gone flat years ago. The noise from the other side was a physical weight, pressing against his temples, but he forced it into the background. In his world, there was only the wood in front of him. He wasn't using plywood sheets. He was repairing the original tongue-and-groove decking, sourcing reclaimed cedar boards that matched the density of the original structure. His hands moved with a deceptive slowness. To the untrained eye, like the thousands watching Jax's live stream, Arthur looked like he was stalling. He would pick up a board, sight down its length to check for warping, and then run his hand over the grain to find the direction of the fibers. He picked up his chisel. It was a simple tool, the steel stained dark with age, the handle polished by the oil of his own skin. He set the edge against a protruding beam that had rotted slightly at the connection point. He didn't hack at it. He pushed. The steel pared away the rot in thin, clean shavings, revealing the healthy, honey-colored wood underneath. Arthur wasn't just covering a hole. He was knitting the building back together. But his body was rebelling. A sharp, hot wire of pain ran from his right shoulder down to his elbow, rotator cuff inflammation he'd been ignoring for 5 years. Every time he raised the heavy wooden mallet, his arm trembled. He had to pause, waiting for the muscle to stop spasming, clenching his jaw so tight his teeth ached. Down below, the screen door of the caretaker's unit creaked open. Maya stepped out again. She had abandoned her coloring book. She stood in the shadow of the great oak tree, looking up. The noise of Jax's crew scared her. It sounded angry. But her eyes were fixed on Arthur. She saw the tremble. She saw him stop, grip his shoulder, and close his eyes for a long count of 5. "He's too slow," a voice boomed. Jax had walked over to the dividing line of the roof, standing tall and confident while Arthur remained on his knees. Jax kicked a scrap of lumber off the edge of the roof, not bothering to watch where it landed. "Hey, Artie," Jax called out, using the nickname like a pat on the head. "My guys are already 30% done with the sheathing. You're still prepping the frame? At this rate, the storm's gonna wash you off the roof before you lay a single shingle." Arthur didn't look up. He was fitting a new piece of cedar into the slot he'd just cleaned. It had to be a friction fit. Tight enough to hold without nails, loose enough to expand when the rain came. He tapped it gently. The wood groaned, then seated perfectly with a solid, dull thud. "The wood talks if you listen," Arthur murmured, mostly to himself. "The wood doesn't pay the bills, speed does," Jax countered, turning back to his crew. In his haste, he fumbled a clip of nails for his gun. The plastic strip broke, and 20 gleaming steel nails scattered across the shingles, sliding down toward the gutter. Jax didn't even look at them. He just reached into his pouch for a fresh clip, loaded his gun, and fired another volley into the plywood. Thump, thump, thump. Arthur stopped. He looked at the wasted nails glinting in the gutter. He remembered a time when metal was scarce, when you straightened a bent nail because you couldn't afford a new one. He remembered that waste was a sin, not because of money, but because it showed a lack of care. Slowly, painfully, Arthur crawled down toward the gutter on the dividing line. He reached out and picked up the nails Jax had dropped. He gathered them into his palm, the cold steel biting into his callous skin. He didn't throw them back. He didn't scold the younger man. He simply placed them into the pocket of his apron, saving them. From the ground, Maya saw this. She didn't understand construction. She didn't know what a moisture barrier was or why cedar was better than plywood. But she understood what it meant when someone picked up what another person threw away. The wind picked up, swirling dust across the parking lot. The leaves on the oak tree turned over, showing their pale undersides, nature's way of flagging a warning. The air grew heavy, static electricity prickling the hair on Arthur's arms. The storm wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was a promise. Arthur looked west. The clouds were stacking up like dark bruises, tall and violent. He looked at his unfinished section, then at his trembling hand. He took a breath that rattled in his chest, picked up his mallet, and went back to work. He couldn't be fast, so he had to be perfect. The silence that fell over the north side of the roof was sudden and absolute. The relentless thrum of the air compressors cut out, leaving a ringing emptiness in the air. Jack stood at the very peak of the roof, silhouetted against a sky that had turned the color of a fresh bruise. He raised his nail gun high above his head like a trophy, then unclipped the hose and let it slide down the shingles, coiling like a dead snake on the grass below. "Time," Jax yelled, his voice cracking with adrenaline. He checked his smartwatch, then pivoted to the tripod where his phone was still recording. 4 hours and 12 minutes. That is a new county record, folks. Look at it. Clean line, seamless ridge cap, ready for anything. He spread his arms wide, soaking in a victory that felt inevitable. From the ground, his crew clapped, a smattering of applause that sounded thin in the heavy, humid air. They looked tired, their shirts soaked through, but they were grinning. They had won. They had beaten the storm, and they had beaten the old man. On the south side, there was no applause. There was only the rhythmic, labored sound of breathing. Arthur was still on his knees. He was barely 2/3 of the way up the slope. His shirt was dark with sweat, clinging to a back that was bowed under the weight of the afternoon. To the casual observer, he looked defeated. His section of the roof wasn't sleek like Jax's. It was a textured mosaic of individual shingles, each one hand-nailed, each row overlapping the one below it by exactly 5/8 of an inch. Jax walked along the ridgeline, balancing carelessly on the edge of his completed masterpiece. He stopped right at the border where his smooth plywood met Arthur's exposed framing. "Pack it up, Artie," Jack said, not unkindly, but with the pity one reserves for a sick pet. "You gave it a shot. But look at the sky. You're not going to beat the rain, and I'm not going to let you ruin the interior of this building just to prove a point. My guys can tarp your side in 10 minutes. Arthur didn't stop. He reached into his apron, pulled out a galvanized nail, and positioned it. His arm shook, a violent tremor that traveled from his elbow to his wrist. He had to use his other hand to steady the hammer. He wasn't fighting Jax anymore. He was fighting his own biology. "The glue needs 24 hours to cure," Arthur said. His voice was dry, like sandpaper on stone. He didn't look up. "You used rapid set adhesive on damp plywood. It won't hold. Jax rolled his eyes, turning back to his camera to wrap up the live stream. Okay, folks, the old timer is struggling a bit with the reality check. But that's why we're here. Innovation saves the day. And then the world turned gray. It didn't start with rain. It started with a drop in pressure so severe it made eardrums pop. The leaves on the oak trees simply stopped moving, frozen in a terrifying stillness. The birds fell silent. The air temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a span of seconds, transforming the muggy heat into a cold, clammy breath on the back of the neck. Maya, still sitting on the porch steps, stood up. She dropped her coloring book. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the brick wall of the building, her eyes locked on the tree line where the clouds were descending like a falling ceiling. The wind didn't build up. It arrived all at once. A gust slammed into the side of the Veterans Hall with the force of a freight train. The impact was physical, shaking the scaffolding and rattling the windows in their frames. Dust and leaves spiraled up from the parking lot in a blinding vortex. On the north side, Jax's side, the physics of speed began to unravel. Because Jax had focused on the look, not the structure, he had relied on the chemical bond of the glue to hold the large sheets of plywood in place while the few nails did the rest. But the humidity had kept the wood damp, and the glue hadn't bonded. It sat on the surface like grease. When the wind hit the overhang, it didn't flow over the roof, it hooked underneath it. There was a sound, not a snap, but a long, agonizing tear like heavy canvas being ripped apart. Jax, who was halfway down the ladder to celebrate, froze. He looked up. The edge of his pristine, flat roof was lifting. The plywood sheets, no longer anchored by the heavy weight of time and craftsmanship, began to shudder. They flapped violently against the rafters, pulling the nails straight out of the soft pine. "No," Jax whispered. He scrambled back up the ladder, his face draining of color. "No, no, no." Another gust hit, stronger this time. A 4x8 sheet of plywood on the far corner ripped free completely. It caught the wind like a kite, cartwheeling through the air with terrifying speed before smashing into the windshield of Jax's massive black truck in the parking lot. The glass shattered, spiderwebbing instantly. But on the south side, the wind met resistance. Arthur had stopped hammering. He lay flat against the roof, pressing his body into the shingles he had just laid. His work didn't move. The cedar shingles, nailed individually with ring-shank nails that gripped the wood fibers like fishhooks, chattered slightly in the wind, but held fast. The interlocking joinery, designed centuries ago for exactly this kind of weather, flexed. It didn't fight the wind. It absorbed it. Jax was screaming now, his voice lost in the roar of the gale. He was on the roof, trying to hold down a lifting sheet of plywood with his own body weight. He looked small, terrifyingly small, against the backdrop of the storm. His nail gun was empty. His glue was useless. The future was falling apart beneath his feet, and the drop to the concrete below was 20 feet of hard reality. Arthur raised his head. He wiped rain from his eyes. The deluge had finally begun. He looked across the ridge. He saw the panic in Jax's eyes, the sheer animal terror of a man who realizes his foundation is built on sand. Arthur didn't smile. He didn't look at the camera. He grabbed his hammer, tightened his grip until his knuckles turned white, and began to crawl. Not down toward safety, but up, toward the line where the solid wood met the collapsing paper fortress. The rain didn't fall. It drove sideways, stinging the skin like handfuls of thrown gravel. On the north slope, the world had dissolved into a gray, violent blur. Jax Sterling was no longer a CEO or an influencer. He was just a terrified young man spread-eagled across a 4x8 sheet of swaying plywood, his fingers clawing uselessly at the wet surface. Physics was winning. The wind had found a gap in the hastily applied adhesive, and the board beneath Jack's was bucking like a wild animal trying to throw its rider. If it flipped, it would take him with it, tumbling 20 feet down onto the concrete steps where Maya stood frozen. "Help!" Jack screamed. But the wind snatched the word from his mouth and shredded it before it could travel 3 feet. He squeezed his eyes shut, his expensive boots sliding on the slick, glue-smeared wood. He felt the board lift another inch. He braced himself for the fall. Then a weight slammed onto the board beside him. It wasn't the wind. It was heavy, solid, and smelled of wet wool and sawdust. Jax opened his eyes. Through the curtain of rain, he saw a pair of worn leather work boots digging into the roof. Arthur was there. The old man wasn't standing. He was crouched low, his center of gravity rooted to the structure. He looked less like a man and more like a gargoyle carved from the building itself. Immovable, ancient, and utterly calm. Arthur didn't say a word. He didn't look at Jax's tear-streaked face. He reached into the deep pocket of his soaked apron. His hand came out with a fistful of nails, the same bright steel nails Jax had dropped in the gutter hours ago. The ones Jax had been too busy to pick up. "Hold it," Arthur commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the howling wind with a flat, undeniable authority. Jack stared at him, paralyzed. "I said hold the damn wood, son," Arthur barked, his eyes flashing behind water-slicked glasses. Jax obeyed on instinct. He threw his weight onto the corner of the peeling plywood, pressing down with everything he had left. Arthur swung. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. Despite the arthritis, despite the cold that must have been agonizing in his joints, Arthur's swing was a study in kinetic memory. The hammer came down. Steel met steel. The nail drove home in one clean stroke, biting deep into the rafter below. He moved 6 inches to the left. Swing. Drive. 6 inches more. Swing. Drive. He was sewing the roof back down, stitch by stitch. Jax watched, mesmerized and terrified. He saw the water streaming off Arthur's face, dripping from the end of his nose. He saw the veins bulging in the old man's forearm, the muscles straining against the storm. This wasn't content. This wasn't a time lapse. This was a man fighting nature with nothing but a piece of iron and 40 years of knowing where the bones of the house lay. "The next one is yours," Arthur shouted, spitting rainwater. He reached into his pocket and slapped 3 nails into Jax's trembling palm. He shoved the wooden-handled hammer into Jax's hand. "I can't," Jax stammered, his teeth chattering. I don't have the gun." "You have an arm," Arthur said. He grabbed Jax's wrist, forcing the hammer head down toward the wood. "Find the stud. Listen for the solid sound. Drive it home." Jax swallowed hard. He looked at the nail. He looked at the shaking plywood that protected the little girl downstairs. He took a breath that tasted of ozone and fear. He swung. He missed the head of the nail, bending it sideways. "Again," Arthur ordered, leaning close, his shoulder pressing against Jax's to block the wind. "Don't look at the storm. Look at the nail." Jax swung again. This time the hammer connected. It wasn't pretty, and it took 3 hits to sink it. But the wood held. A spark of something, not pride but survival, flared in Jax's chest. He reached for another nail. For the next 10 minutes, they didn't speak. They were just 2 men on a roof in a hurricane, linked by the rhythm of the work. The flashy contractor and the silent carpenter, inching their way across the disaster zone, pinning down the future with the discarded scraps of the past. When the last nail was driven flush, the plywood stopped shaking. The roof was ugly, scarred with bent nails and hammer marks, but it was still. Arthur sat back on his heels, his chest heaving. He wiped his face with a soaking wet sleeve. He looked at Jax. The younger man was trembling, but he wasn't looking at his phone. He was staring at the hammer in his hand, gripping it like a lifeline. Below them, the storm raged on, tearing branches from the trees and sending trash cans skittering down the street. But inside the veterans' hall, under the ugly, patched-up roof, it was dry. Arthur reached over and gently took the hammer back. He slipped it into his loop. "You've got a decent swing," Arthur said, his voice barely audible over the rain, "when you stop showing off." Jax looked at Arthur, really looked at him, for the first time all day. The arrogance was washed clean away, leaving only a raw, stunned silence. "You saved me," Jax whispered. Arthur didn't answer. He just turned and began the slow, careful descent toward the ladder. "Storm's not over yet. Don't slip." The storm broke as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean and a silence that felt heavy. The parking lot was a landscape of wet asphalt and scattered leaves. Steam began to rise from the hoods of the idling trucks as the late afternoon sun broke through the retreating clouds, casting long golden shadows across the battered facade of the Veterans Community Hall. Jack stood inside the main assembly room. The air was cool and smelled of damp plaster. He wasn't looking at his phone. It sat on a folding table nearby, the screen dark. The live stream ended long ago. He was standing in the center of the room, looking up. The ceiling was a map of his failure. On the north side of the room, the section covered by his rapid-fire crew, dark, spreading stains bloomed across the white acoustic tiles like bruises. Water dripped steadily, a rhythmic, accusing tapping sound, falling into a constellation of plastic buckets that Maya and her mother had scrambled to set up. Plink, plink, plink. The liquid stone adhesive hadn't cured in the humidity. The seals had failed. The speed had cost them the shelter. Jax walked slowly to the center of the room, crossing the invisible line that divided the building's structure. He looked up at the south side. It was bone dry. The ceiling tiles were pristine. Not a single drop of water had breached Arthur's defense. The hand-planed joinery, the carefully overlapped shingles, the refusal to rush. It had all held. It was a physical testament to a philosophy Jax had spent his entire career mocking. The silence on this side of the room wasn't empty. It was strong. The back door opened, letting in a draft of fresh, rain-scented air. Arthur walked in. He had removed his tool belt, and his flannel shirt was dark with rain, stuck to his shoulders. He looked exhausted, his age showing in the stiff way he favored his right leg. But he moved with that same steady, unhurried rhythm. He didn't look at the ceiling. He went straight to the corner where he had stashed his thermos. Jax watched him for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, uncomfortable and thick. Outside, the younger crew members were packing up the pneumatic compressors, moving quietly, their earlier bravado washed away by the storm. "I owe you for the roof," Jax said finally. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual polished, broadcast-ready cadence. He didn't turn around. He kept his eyes fixed on the water stains above his head. "And for the truck, and for pulling me back from the edge." Arthur poured a cup of coffee. The steam curled up around his face. "Truck's just metal. Roof's just wood. You can fix both." Jax turned. He looked young now, younger than his 30 years. The swagger was gone, leaving behind a man who realized he didn't know nearly as much as he thought he did. I told 300,000 people that you were obsolete. I told them speed was the only thing that mattered. He gestured helplessly at the buckets catching the leaks. I was wrong. It was a rare thing, in Arthur's experience, for a man to admit he was wrong while the evidence was still dripping on his head. He took a slow sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth. You weren't wrong about the speed, son, Arthur said gently. You were wrong about the purpose. You build a house to sell it. I build a house to hold it. He walked over to where Jack stood. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out the handful of bent, unused nails he had saved from the gutter earlier that day. He placed them on the table next to Jack's dark phone. You have good hands, Arthur said. Stronger than mine ever were. But you have to let the material tell you what it needs. You can't force a building to stand. You have to ask it nicely. Jax looked down at the nails. They were scrap metal, garbage to anyone else. But to him, in that moment, they looked like a lesson he would never forget. I'm going to fix the north side, Jack said, a new resolve hardening in his voice. I'm going to rip off the plywood. I'm going to do it right. No glue, no shortcuts, on my dime. Arthur nodded once, a sharp chin-down motion that signaled approval. Good. Use the ring-shank nails this time, and wait for the wood to dry. Arthur finished his coffee and screwed the cap back onto his thermos. He picked up his old wooden toolbox. It was time to go. The job, his part of it at least, was done. Arthur? Jax called out as the old man reached the door. Arthur paused, his hand on the frame. Why did you do it? Jax asked, the question hanging in the damp air. You could have let me fail. You could have let the roof blow off and proved your point to the whole world. Why did you crawl out there to save my work? Arthur looked back. His eyes drifted past Jax, past the leaking ceiling, landing on something unseen in the distance of his memory. Because the house doesn't care who builds it, Arthur said. It only cares if it can keep the people inside dry. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the evening light. The sunset had finally broken through the storm front, painting the parking lot in deep purples and bruised oranges. The air was crisp now, scrubbed clean of the humidity, carrying the sharp scent of ozone and wet asphalt. Arthur stood by his truck. It was a faded Ford, the kind with square headlights and a bed-scratched silver from years of hauling lumber. He didn't throw his tools in. He placed them. The chisel went into its leather roll. The handplane was wiped down with an oily rag before being set in its wooden box. It was a ritual of closure, a way of telling the day that it was done. Jax jogged across the lot, his boots splashing through the puddles that mirrored the twilight sky. He was holding a checkbook. The ink on the paper was likely still wet. Arthur, wait, Jax called out, breathless, not from exertion, but from the weight of his own realization. Arthur paused, his hand on the driver's side door handle. He didn't turn fully, just angled his head, waiting. The bet, Jack said, extending the slip of paper. The contract, the prize money, it's yours. You won. I can't take this job. Not after today. Arthur looked at the check held out in the younger man's hand. It was a lot of money. Enough to retire on, or at least enough to fix up his own truck and rest his aching shoulder for a few months. But he didn't reach for it. He didn't even look at the numbers. I didn't bet, Arthur said, his voice low and steady. You did. But you saved the building, Jax insisted, stepping closer. You saved me. Take it, please. It's the only way I can square this. Arthur finally turned. He looked at Jax, and for the first time, his expression softened. It wasn't pity anymore. It was the look a father gives a son who has finally learned a hard lesson. "If you want to square it," Arthur said, "spend that money on better lumber. Buy the real cedar. Let it acclimate for 3 days before you nail it down. Do the job right when nobody is filming." Jax lowered his hand, the check fluttering uselessly in the breeze. "I will," he promised. "I swear I will." Arthur nodded, satisfied. He opened the truck door, the hinges creaking with a familiar, rusty complaint. But before he could climb in, a small movement caught his eye. Maya was running across the wet grass. She didn't have her coloring book this time. She was holding a plastic bottle of water, warm from being held in her hands. She stopped a few feet away, shy suddenly, looking up at the old man who had spent the day fighting the sky for her sake. She held out the water. Arthur smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that crinkled the deep lines around his eyes. He took the bottle. "Thank you, little one." "Are you coming back?" Maya asked, her voice small. "The roof is in good hands now," Arthur said, nodding toward Jax. An older woman, the head of the community board, stepped out onto the porch. She had been watching from the doorway. She walked down the steps, her arms crossed against the evening chill. She looked at Jax, then at Arthur. "He doesn't know, does he?" the woman asked softly. Jax looked between them, confused. "Know what?" The woman rested a hand on the brick corner of the building. "You kept asking why Arthur was so slow, why he treated every piece of wood like it was gold." She smiled sadly. 40 years ago, this lot was just dirt. Arthur didn't just fix the roof today, young man. He poured the foundation. He framed these walls with his father. He built this place from the ground up. Jax froze. He looked at the building, really looked at it, and then back at the old carpenter. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't been racing a competitor. He had been challenging the creator. The man knew where the bones were because he was the one who had set them. "You built it?" Jax whispered. Arthur climbed into his truck, the seat springs groaning under his weight. He rolled down the window, resting his arm on the sill. "We don't really build anything, son," Arthur said, starting the engine. It turned over with a reluctant, throaty cough before settling into a steady idle. "We just borrow the wood for a while. It's our job to make sure it stands long enough to matter." He put the truck in gear. "Keep your nails straight," Arthur added, a final piece of advice drifting out the window. As the truck rolled slowly out of the parking lot, its taillights fading into the dusk, Jack stood alone in the center of the wet asphalt. He looked down at his high-tech tools, then up at the silent, sturdy roofline against the darkening sky. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to post about it. He put his phone in his pocket, picked up the hammer Arthur had left behind, and turned back toward the work that still needed to be done. The foundation was silent, but it held them all up just the same. Sometimes, it takes a storm to show us who really built the roof over our heads. Jax thought he was racing a rival, but in the end, he was being guided by a master. "I want to ask you something, and I'd love to hear your honest thoughts in the comments. Do you think our society has traded the value of doing it right for the convenience of doing it fast? Or do you still see that old-school craftsmanship alive today? If you have an Arthur in your life, someone who taught you that quality matters more than speed, share their name below. Let's give them the recognition they deserve. And if this story reminded you of what's truly important, you are in the right place. Go ahead and click that subscribe button. We have so many more stories about the quiet heroes who hold our world together, and I don't want you to miss the next one. I'll see you there.